stream. Mm-hmm. Oh yeah. Actually, yeah. I need to mention that for my online students as well. So give me just a second, because I realized that I'd left it with that language on there, and I didn't need to do that. So let me make sure that this is running, and I will respond to that immediately. Okay. So yeah. Dang it. So yeah, in the prompt for the paper, I do mention that the only source that's required is the book. That was back when I was teaching upstate and the books were provided for everybody. Um, and that was also before like I was like, you guys can just do whatever. So that's a little bit outdated. You do not have to use the book at all. Um, in fact, I would prefer that even if you do use the book, you also have some kind of outside source. So yeah, use whatever sources you can find. I mean, this was also when I was teaching in a school where not everybody necessarily had internet access, so it was easier for them to use the book. Um, I assume most of you, especially my online people, have internet access, I would hope. So yeah, just find a couple of internet sources. You know, history.com, Encyclopedia Britannica, whatever, just some simple stuff. Um, yeah, not necessarily Wikipedia, but you can use that as like a point of finding sources. Um, but yeah, when I say that the book's the only one you have to, that's outdated. I need to fix that. Um, but that was like if that's the only source that you had, that was acceptable. Um, but also, you don't have to do the default topic if you don't want. Even though that was my default topic, in this one is a lot more broad than back when I only did European history, where I was very specific and had the same paper 100 times, and that was awful. But yes, thank you for asking that, because I got a lot of emails from my online people asking that. I was like, I need to do some kind of like mass email or announcement post. So yes, thank you. So yeah, if you don't have access to the book, that's totally fine. That was an older post. Um, any other questions? In fact, actually bouncing off of that, that's perfect for what I was going to announce. Just as a reminder, paper is due week from Wednesday. So not this coming Wednesday, but week from, so March 6th as a reminder. Just FYI. And again, those of you that are in here, if you could physically hand them in, that's great. If you don't have access to a printer at home, because Lord knows I don't, that's fine. We do have printers here at the school that if you can like email it to yourself and then print it out here, you can do that. If you don't have time to do all that, you can email that to me. It's fine. Just send it to my riley.holt@fmarion email. And this is double for you online folks. Send me an attached document, like a Word document or a PDF document or something. Don't just attach me a link to a Google Doc, because that doesn't always work. There's a lot of times when it's like, you need to get permission to view the document, and I'll send the request for that, and I don't always get it back right away, and then I'm not able to get back to it because I've got like 100 papers to go through. So attach something. If you can attach the Google Doc file, I don't know how all that works, because I haven't used Google Docs a whole lot because I'm old. I guess that would work. I've had that work a couple of times for some students, but just put the document on the email. Don't copy paste the document into the email, because that messes up the formatting, but just like attach it, and then that'll be fine. that's all I've got for the paper that I can think of right now. Anything else from you guys? Okay, I'm sure I'll be getting some emails from my online folks for any more questions from them, but okay. Well, back to the notes then. We should be finishing up this chapter and moving on to 19, which, I mean, speaking of stuff to do, as a reminder, once we finish chapter 19, it'll be on to test 2, so we're moving right along. So we talked about this last time, moving from the cloud scrapers of wrought iron to the skyscrapers of structural steel, especially with electric elevators and radiators that allowed them to go even higher. Levels of transportation allowing for the city to expand outward, as well as the bridges. And then also with the transportation, it allowed for the upper middle classes to escape from the congested and soon to be very poor conditions of the inner cities, where the poor were pretty much trapped in high rent and low wages. And we will get to that in just a moment, because boy, it got bad real fast. So just again, some images here of the wrought iron buildings, which look pretty nice because they took longer to build, so they had time to get a little artsy with them. And the first, pretty sure this was the first skyscraper, the Flatiron building. Whoop, don't know why I did all that. Settle down. There. This clock tower here. The various buildings there. Next to the graveyard. Radiator, if you haven't seen one. In fact, I just saw a thing this morning of this moose like licking the dirt off the side of someone's truck, and I didn't get it at first, and then I realized, oh, it's the salt from the road because, you know, the snow. I was like, I didn't get it because we don't have that here. I mean, besides, we don't have moose here. But, you know, if the side of your car is dirty, it's just like road dirt. It's not from the salt. We don't get snow. But when you get in areas where there's snow and you get snow all the side of your car, it's dirty once it melts. And then just a couple of trolleys and whatnot. A lot of neat images of that. All right. So, as we mentioned, the middle and upper class got to the small neighborhoods outside of the cities. The working class were stuck with property values skyrocketing. The only way to survive were with these tall, cramped multifamily apartments known as tenements. A tenement is described as, or legally defined as containing more than 3 families. So this is not an apartment where, you know, you've got a bunch of housing units close together and you have your own unit, usually 1 family per unit, or, you know, a couple of people that aren't necessarily related living together to split the rent. This is 3 or more families living together in a single unit. There was no kind of sanitation, very little ventilation, so lots of disease, because, I mean, again, this was like late 1800s, early 1900s. They didn't have any real concept of, like, germ theory. And also, if a fire started, it just got everybody. We already talked about the, or did we talk about the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory already? Yeah, we did. No, we haven't. Never mind. Get to that in a minute. Yeah, if something caught on fire, it got everybody. There's actually a lot of stories of apartments like this, well, tenements like this, catching on fire and just hundreds of people dying. There's a particularly bad one in Britain where this happened. Also, you could make a tenement a workplace, because it wasn't bad enough to live there, you could also have to work there. Put in some sewing machines or cigar rollers, and bam, you had a sweatshop. And since this technically wasn't a factory, the owners could keep wages extra low and not have to worry about regulations, because you had to have regulations at a factory, but if you put some machines in a tenement, then it technically wasn't a factory, and therefore you didn't have to do any regulations. So don't worry about it. This is where I was getting to. I got ahead of myself. Now, while factories did have some level of regulations, wasn't a whole lot. 1911, this was the most famous of these incidents, certainly not the only one. But the main reason it's the most well known is it was right in the middle of a heavily populated area. 1911, Triangle Shirtwaist Company in New York City's Greenwich Village had a fire on its 8th floor, which spread to the 9th and 10th. So we had a couple of issues right away. One, fire engine ladders couldn't reach that high. The fire departments hadn't caught up to the technology of the architecture of the day. Also, one of the exit doors on the 9th floor was locked in order to prevent workers from stealing material. So people were literally locked in the building while it was burning. So 146 people died in this fire. Some leapt from windows to not die in the flames, but most of the bodies were found trapped behind that very locked door. So, which is to say, the number would not have been nearly as high had the door not been locked, which is why to this day, very rarely, if ever, have like locked interior doors in buildings, or at least, you know, you don't have doors that are locked from the outside. You should always be able to get out of a building. And I'll get a little bit more into this when we get to the images, because I've got several, because again, this was one of the most famous / infamous of these incidents. There were news reports obviously on it at the time, all sorts of footage of it happening. So of course there's all sorts of historic videos on it. So there's all sorts of things you can see and learn about this event today, beyond just the little bit they go over in the book. I think this one could bleed over into the next paper if you're interested in doing a little research on this one. So here's some tenements. People kind of just sort of crammed into the corner of these very small apartments. And, when you say 3 or more families, these are like Irish immigrant families, so they've got a lot of kids. Again, some of these look like frontier homes. And there's this one specifically reminded me of a place I saw in Dublin from the train, so that's why I chose it. But yeah, if you're doing your washing, you got to just hang it out the window and hope it stays on the line. Here again, folks just crammed in whatever space they can fit. This is the yard. It's just a concrete block. Here's the cellar, where all the trash just kind of flows to, because obviously they didn't have any kind of trash disposal to speak of. Here's some sweatshop stuff. I think these guys are making shoes. Wait. There's a dog down there. So they're not doing too bad. There's some sewing machines. Again, in these tiny tenements, they're cramming machines in. Here's the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire. So again, they didn't have ladders to get high enough to get the people out. They at least had enough pressure in the hoses to get some water up there. But it wasn't quite enough to completely douse the fires. Here's some of the results of the people jumping. The people that made it to the fire escapes weren't necessarily safe because the fire escapes weren't exactly to code. Well, it wasn't just the fire escapes weren't to code, it's just the fire was burning so hot it like melted the fire escapes. It was a really bad fire. Here's the before and after of the shop floor. I mean, you can see the fire burned so hot it actually destroyed some of these columns. Besides everything else, you can see some of the wiring from where the lights were. And here's that second one, larger. See, some of the columns are actually support columns, so they're still there, but the other ones that were more decorative are just gone. So, this one's in the book. Once again, being a garment factory, because a shirt waist is like part of a piece of clothing. Well, actually, yeah, here's a piece in the book. This company's 600 garment workers were immigrant women. Building had inadequate fire escapes, blocked exits, which resulted in a high death toll. The catastrophe aroused many New Yorkers to rally around factory reforms. Aftermath of the fire, Rose Schneiderman, Polish-Jewish immigrant who had led a strike at Triangle Shirtwaist Company in 1909, addressed a memorial gathered at the Metropolitan Opera House. I'll be a traitor to this poor burned bodies if I were to come here and talk about good fellowship. We have tried you good people of the public, and we have found you wanting. The Inquisition had its rack and its thumbscrews and its instruments of torture with iron teeth. You know what these things are today? The iron teeth are necessities. The thumbscrews are the high-powered swift machinery close to which we must work. The rack here is the fire trap structures which will destroy us the minute they catch fire. So, yeah. One of the reasons why this was remembered so immediately among the New Yorkers is because pretty much everyone who died in this were young women. And that's going to stick more than like a coal mine collapse. And it was a bunch of like, middle-aged men. And also a coal mine is out in the middle of nowhere. You're not really going to know who they were. But this was in the middle of the city. So this, while it was one of the worst factory disasters, at least in American history, it did lead to immediate reform. It led to a lot of factory safety standards being updated. Obviously, we're not locking doors. Fire escapes being made usable. And also even like the fire departments, at least in New York, were upgraded and made to be able to handle well, the infrastructure of bigger cities. So, undeniable tragedy. I'm not trying to sugarcoat that, but there was at least a silver lining of it led to changes that made events like this less likely to happen again. Now, I would have a video here with the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory, but we don't quite have time, and also it would mess up my online flow, so we're not going to worry too much about that. All right, a bit more on how the cities were, because we're not quite done yet. So the poor tended to not have very nutritional diets because, well, they didn't have the money to afford much of anything. Lack of sanitation, cramped conditions, lots of disease in the slums. Cholera, typhoid, yellow fever, tens of thousands died in the 1870s and 1880s. I mean, this sounds like, medieval Europe when they started developing cities. Like, hey, we've got this new type of place to live. Okay, cool. People die really fast. Maybe we're going to stay in the countryside. Nearly a quarter of American children born in cities never reached their first birthday because, again, the disease was terrible. So the best way to not die in a city was to have decent running water. But with so many people living in such a small area, you needed lots and lots of water because, I say people, all living things need water to live. So the place to get water most often was the river because, that's where the water was. Problem was, that's also where sewage was dumped. So, that's where a lot of the disease came from. Look at Paris. Paris had cholera outbreaks like every 2 or 3 years because they would get their water from the river where they also dumped all their poo. Wasn't a good situation until they got aqueducts. There was also the issue of traffic. I know you think today it feels like traffic's more of a modern issue. My dad acts like there wasn't traffic back in his day. Even in the late 1800s, the roads were crowded and often unpaved. But here's the thing. In the late 1800s, there weren't cars. There were horses and buggies. And whereas cars make, air pollution, what do horses make? Anyone been around a horse any period of time? Anyone even seen a horse field? Everybody upstate knew this for sure because they all were into horses. I think you guys know this, you just don't want to say it. What would cause an issue in the middle of a road that a horse would cause? Well, that's his thing too, but more common than a horse dying. Horses poop a lot. And when there's a lot of horses on the road, there's a lot of poop in the road. And when it would rain, it would just turn it into slush. And also the roads weren't paved, so it would just mix with the mud and just make this horrible slurry. Yeah, it was bad. Now, unfortunately, I need to find it in my other PowerPoint and move it to this one. But I had an image of like a wagon wheel up to its axle in, let's just say mud. It wasn't mud. Well, it wasn't just mud, I'll just say, after a heavy rain. And that's one of the reasons why horses got phased out. Yeah. And then there's also crime. Cramped living conditions, poor wages. So many young folks turned to lives of crime. U.S. murder rate quadrupled between 1880 and 1900, while the murder rates in Europe were going down. New York City had places like Bandit's Roost, Hell's Kitchen, groups like the Sewer Rats and Rock Gang. Poverty left many with little choice but theft and prostitution to survive. So yeah, cities weren't great. Yet they were still seen as like the place of opportunity compared to the farmlands. Let's see. Oh, yeah, that's the... this is one of my... I know I say this a lot. I really like this image. It's one of the many notices of the day. I like how they've got like 12 different fonts. And obviously they didn't have like a word processor back then, so they had to switch out the type for every time they changed the font. Notice prevention of cholera, etc., temperate eating and drinking, established from cold water, blah, 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 sleep and clothed warm, and a little like finger pointing, do not sleep or sit in a draught of air, avoid getting wet. Now this was before like they really understood what made people sick. It was this idea that it was like this miasma in the air or something. It was this bad air that got people sick, not actually like you're drinking poo water. So yeah, the germ theory wasn't quite out yet. Also, one of you was about on this. This was a thing. Kids playing in the road next to an expired horse. Because like if you're going down the road and your horse dies, you can't exactly drag it off. It's too heavy. You just leave it there. The city will take care of it probably. Maybe. Eventually. Or the kids will, poke at it with a stick. At least that road is sort of paved.
Was that the dead horse?
Yes. Yeah, the kid's playing with a dead horse. I mean, what else are you going to do in the 1880s? Here they are burning fires to try to get rid of the fever germs because, again, they just figured it was bad air and they could get rid of the... Oh, right, I forgot. I remember now where this is going. Also, all these factories that were happening, were producing all sorts of bad stuff and just dumping them into the rivers. It wasn't just sewage that was going to the rivers. It was just all sorts of wild chemicals. Like I know today, we are still dumping all sorts of amazing stuff into the water. Most of that is at least to some degree filtered. Well, usually. Back then, though, like I know looking at it, it's like, yeah, I mean, the water looks gross, but it's also in black and white, so it's hard to tell. Let me give you an idea of how bad this was. The rivers often caught on fire. I think this is the river in question. There's a river in Chicago that caught on fire 13 times. To the point that the Environmental Protection Agency was created to keep this from happening. The EPA was created because this kept happening. When rivers catch on fire, something's wrong. Anyway, here's some of the bad neighborhoods. I know I already had this image before, but this is perfect for like, this to me just says Bandit's Roost. This is Bandit's Roost in my mind. I don't know what the hell this is, but I don't know, it just says Rock Gang to me, but it's like, why is this like old prospector's house in the middle of New York? Here's a place where a bunch of people got murdered. Mention where Elsie Siegel met her murderer. Mission where Elsie Siegel met her slave. It's the same person. Why is it written there twice? Anyway, this is where somebody got murdered. Here's some mafia lads. Some more crime folks. Right. So the final section in this chapter, before we move on to 19, is the idea of political machines and city bosses. So, again, this kind of goes back to the idea of European cities, where the counts or the king or whatever would have some level of control over the countryside. But when it came to cities, they were more or less left on their own. So it was sort of the same here, where federal and state governments would let cities kind of do their own thing. But the mayors themselves often also held very little power, which seems like it doesn't make a lot of sense to me. It feels like the mayor should have the power over the city because that's what they were elected to do, is run the city, but whatever, I don't know. I'm not 1890 Chicago. Instead, we had a bunch of private companies who all ran things, which led to a lot of duplication of stuff. So it mentions here 1890 Chicago had 11 branches of government that all were at odds with each other. So when I think of like private companies running a city, I think of, you know, private, well, I was going to say Texas is a good example. Private power. You know, oh well, if they're competing with one another, then it'll lower power cost or lower sewage costs, and then it just ends up like not being efficient at all. So these competing branches of government, not competing political parties, but competing branches of government, were eventually pulled under the so-called political machine, with a boss at the top. And to maintain power, they practice a form of limited welfare. Pass out turkeys on holidays, cold during the winter, give shelter and meals to people if a tenement burned down, which, was a common thing. They'd attend barbecues, picnics, attend christenings, bar mitzvahs, weddings, funerals, etc. And then certain immigrants, like the Irish, probably the Italians as well eventually, will be allowed to work with the political machines and gain some level of upward mobility. Now, it wasn't just immigrants who benefited from this. Local businessmen also profited. Political machines helped them get through red tape because, again, when you had different branches of government in a city run by private companies competing with each other, you'd often have to get a permit from these different branches that cover the same thing. So it was a freaking nightmare to get anything done. But if you've got one dude who's overseeing everybody, you can talk to him and he'll get things fixed for you. So this would apply to legitimate businessmen and less legitimate businessmen, those dealing in vice, especially when the Prohibition hit and everyone was dealing in alcohol. Now, if this sounds shady, boy, it was. It was 100% corrupt. Voter fraud, including the graveyard vote, where they would go to the graveyard and get names off of tombstones and put that in the vote. Phony names in businesses to funnel funds, which, again, that's just literally a mafia tactic. Political machine bosses were just one step above crime bosses in the cities. I mean, just the name, political machines and city bosses, sounds like something that a mafia boss would do. So yeah, this is technically legit. Mostly, kind of, at least until you get to the end. But it's like really close to mafia stuff. Which is why most of the time, at least until they started killing people, the mafia could get away with stuff because they were so close to technically being legal. And if they did do anything like especially illegal, it was usually through proxies and whatnot. So if we spent any amount of time on this city boss stuff, we would 100% be talking about Boss Tweed. However, we're not, so he's just in some images. So it says here, in counting their strength, Boss Tweed responds with, as long as I count the votes, what are you going to do about it? He was obviously a major city boss and was well known for his corruption. And eventually went to jail, as you can see here. Bribery and corruption right under her nose every day in the week. There the justice being blind and whatnot. So it's like, well, you can do corruption all you want as long as justice doesn't see. And as you can tell there, he was well known for that stance. Another PowerPoint slide I just blatantly stole offline. City governments run by political machines, led by powerful bosses who control a network of politicians. I've got a bigger image of that one on the left so we can look at that a little bit closer. Rally citizens, especially immigrants, to vote for them by offering services. So here you have, as I told my class last time, I've been to a pig picking where you just throw the whole pig on the grill and carve pieces off. I've never seen a full-on cow before. So that's something new to me. Yeah, it says Tammany Hall Barbecue here. Tammany Hall was I mean, I think that's back here. No, is it not? I know I saw Tammany Hall here somewhere. Maybe it was. It was here in the book. Yeah, Tammany Hall machine here in the book. Yeah. So here's that other image again. Party boss handing out special privileges, franchise, immunity against arrest, police protection, that sort of thing. Again, very mafia boss sort of stuff. You know, you either work with a party boss or you're going to be at a major disadvantage. Now, in response to, well, not just the party bosses, or the city bosses, but like everything prior, we have the urban reformers, and this actually leads directly into the next chapter. So certain urban reformers wanted to actually go out and fix the root of the problems rather than the symptoms of said problems, which is what the city bosses were doing. They're like, oh, you people are hungry? We'll give you a little food now and then. Oh, you don't have any money? Well, we'll give you, jobs working for us. Whereas these urban reformers were like, hey, the problem is they're not being educated. The problem is, they're being kept in squalor and having to scrape for whatever they can get, and it's leaving them desperate. 1883, Congress passed the Pendleton Civil Reform Act, required federal jobs to be awarded based on merit, as opposed to just knowing someone in the system. Wow, 1883, we have a meritocracy in America? Who'd have thunk it? Well, at least for some jobs. There are also settlement houses, which hopefully I'll be able to get to in the next chapter before we finish today, which is, again, just a major part of the next chapter. We won't get into too much detail. Basically, it was to help provide aid and education to those that lived in squalor. They understood that immigrants went to taverns and political machines not because they were racially inferior, but because they had nowhere else to go. So again, settlement houses is like a whole separate section in the next chapter. There was also religiously inspired reform. Rather than Conwell's emphasis on getting rich, they believed that unhindered capitalism was inequitable, which provided more losers than winners. Again, that's the next chapter. This is the idea of like like the social gospel, which is to say, like, Jesus was literally all about going out and helping people. Still, though, settlement houses and churches weren't able to handle the roiling masses of the poor and destitute. It'd require government action to adequately take care of everybody. And again, this is just leading into the next chapter. So we'll get to that in just a moment. This is literally the last slide. So this is kind of a conclusion / intro for the next one. And a couple things here. Education about disease, physicians, health officers, isolation and quarantine, antitoxin, which is to say vaccines. Well, what their understanding of vaccines. Disinfection, and that's keeping these terrifying disease dogs away from the children. So our children don't die from diseases that can be easily prevented. Like freaking measles that weren't even a thing until recently again, because some idiots are like, oh no, the vaccines and 5G and my freedom. Because some people don't have brains. Anyway, here's a settlement house. We'll get more into that in a little bit. And the children's actually got, yeah, it was not just like education, but also like making them more well-rounded people. Also, like bathing children. I love these like giant sink bathtubs. All right, let's get into the next chapter real quick before we run out of time. All right. And just FYI, this chapter is largely what I have in mind for you guys for the default topic for the second paper. So I know we haven't quite gotten to the first one yet, but this is kind of what I'm looking at in the second one. So FYI. Anyway, this is 1900, 1917. Obviously, we're going to be poking into World War I a little bit, but we really don't get involved until 1918. So it's not going to be too much. It's going to be in the background for some of it, but it's the next chapter that we really get involved. So after the next test will be, in fact, chapter 20 is Empire and Wars. So chapter 20 is going to be very involved. Right, let's talk about the roots of progressivism. So, everything we've talked about so far. Expansion, industrialization, urbanization, increasing immigration, all this stuff had transformed the country dramatically. And following the economic collapse of the 1890s, many upper middle class Americans felt that something needed to be done or the United States would collapse. And also, this was felt in greater degrees in Europe. But as the world grew closer to 1900, and then after 1900 passed and we started moving more into the 20th century, there was this feeling of moving rapidly towards something terrible. That something was going to happen. And we weren't sure what, but it was going to be bad. And again, the Europeans felt it more acutely because it was going to happen there. And it was indeed World War I, and it was one of the worst things that had ever happened in Europe. And while certainly World War II was worse on a sheer casualty scale, World War I changed a lot of things. And we'll get more into that next chapter, but everybody sort of felt something was coming, even if they couldn't articulate what it was. And again, people back then weren't unaware of what was going on. 1912, progressive newspaper editor said, "The world moves and we have to move with it. So with all that is going on with politics today, it is evolution, not revolution." Now again, here in America, things were far less concerning. He was saying that, we need to move with the world. It's not some dramatic change we need to fight. Granted, by 1912, we were mostly done fighting in the Philippines. Talk about that next chapter too. But we hadn't really seen much conflict. And we also weren't right next to Germany, which was ramping up its military. And also going back to the populists, the progressives had inherited and evolved many of the ideas of the populists. Attack laissez-faire, wanted to reduce power monopolies, introduce an income tax. but they were more concerned with the urban and industrial America as opposed to just rural America. Because especially at the time that this came about, most people lived in cities. The population has shifted dramatically since the time of the Populists, and that's where the big concern was. Not to say that the farmers didn't exist, because again, we've always had farmers, and I'm pretty sure we'll always will have farmers. It's just that the cities needed to be taken care of. So the origins of all this. A couple of terms. These were just things in bolds. I figured I'd toss these in. The idea of pragmatism. Absolute truth was not the realm of some absolute doctrine, but something that could be found through experience. So for them, ideas were measured by practical consequences. They were skeptical of rigid dogma and relied on human experience. Basically, things were a way because that was what was experienced or what was known through someone else's experience, as opposed to this is the way it is because that's how it is. They weren't big fans of that. Not the pragmatic that you often associate it with, where it's like this is the best way of doing it regardless of morals. Now, while this definition of pragmatism does sound like it is somewhat going against like religion, because usually when you talk about you're going against rigid dogma, that sounds specifically like you're attacking the Catholic Church. There was also religious ideals that went into progressivism. The social gospel. Walter Rauschenbusch wrote Christianity and the Social Crisis. He wanted Christians to embrace the teachings of Jesus, in particular the ethical obligations for social justice, in particular working among the poor. Because again, that was Jesus' whole thing. Was like, working among the poor, and those of you who have helped the poor have helped me, etc., etc. So like, that was his whole deal. The middle class also grew pretty dramatically at this time, which often happens when you have a growing urban population. One group in particular was the American Medical Association, or the AMA. Now, technically, it was founded back in 1847, but it was very small and not very powerful. But it grew at the turn of the century, and as it grew, it raised its qualifications for those who practice medicine. In other words, it made it so that if you wanted to be a doctor, you actually had to be qualified, which was good for everybody. I mean, if you want somebody cutting on you, you probably want them to know what they're doing. All right, let's get a little more done before we finish. Justin wisely directed social energies. So this is, again, the idea of, like, social gospel. I'm pretty sure this is Jane Addams. I don't know why I have Jane Addams stuff so early on, but that's for the... this is very specifically Jane Addams, because I love the look on her face. That's Settlement House stuff. I don't know why I have her so early. Oh, Gotham Court, which is just anywhere in New York that's like dark and creepy is just considered like Gotham. Here's AMA. Here's everybody, get on the hill, we're taking a picture. Which I'm sure was a nightmare in the late 1800s. What I do find interesting is, to be in the late 1800s, there's quite a few women among the group. I mean, sure, it's mostly men, but there are several women, so that's pretty neat. Also, there's this dude, I just missed him, there he is, this massive beard. And here's folks from the AMA. It looks like they're talking to FDR. Can't quite tell from that. All right, let's at least get into the muckrakers. This is a term you may have heard before. They were investigative journalists who wanted to expose corruption of the government and shady dealings of corporations. In other words, they had a lot of work ahead of them. They had a lot to do. They worked for magazines like McClure's and Collier's. They used these stories to increase their readership. And this took a lot of work. This was, this wasn't, what's the name? National Enquirer, where they just make crap up. It's like, oh, I marry Bigfoot. They had to get into all sorts of places to get information. A lot of times, not totally legally, maybe like breaking into a corporation and getting documents and stuff. And a lot of what they exposed was very sensationalist and got their readers worked up. So, for example, journalist Ida Tarbell hit on the ruthless and dishonest business practices of the Rockefeller Family Standard Oil Company, which we've already talked about. So she's the one who exposed a lot of that. Lincoln Steffens wrote on the machine bosses in various large American cities, which we talked about, so thank you, Lincoln Steffens. And Ida B. Wells discussed the horrors of lynching of African Americans to the forefront of many readers' minds. Others talked about the fraudulent practice of insurance companies, child labor, drug abuse, and prostitution. So a lot of the horrors of this era were brought to light thanks to these folks. Now, muckraker isn't a positive term, so where'd this come from? Oddly enough, it was Teddy Roosevelt that coined the term, and he was like the progressive president. Compared them to the character in Paul Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress, who's too busy looking at the filth or the muck on the ground that he missed the gift presented to him. He was worried that all this sensationalism that they were putting out would threaten moderate reform, because despite the fact that he was, again, the progressive president, they would cause so much sensationalism among the population that it would make it so that his opponents wouldn't even allow for moderate reform, because they'd be pushing back against the people being overwhelmed by the sensationalism. Despite that, there's a lot of cartoons of the day showing Teddy Roosevelt as like using the muck rake, because that was apparently a thing, like to his advantage, of like sweeping out the senatorial muck. Apparently there was just like this rake you would use to sweep away gunk. Also, here's a meat scan, and we'll get to that in just a little bit. So here is a McClure's magazine from Pittsburgh. Lincoln Steffens. I can't quite read that one. End of the World. That's a good one. Ida B. Tarbell. So there's some stories in that one. McClure's magazine, The Labor Boss. New York by Lincoln Steffens. Truth About Radium. Oh, right. How many of you are familiar with the Radium Girls? Nobody? Any of you know what radium is? Right, so before we had widespread electricity, the big like clock faces in clock towers and whatnot were painted with radium, which glows at night. It's like a glow in the dark clock face. When you have those on your wristwatches sometimes. Well, radium, if you can tell from the name, is radioactive. And the people who would go up and paint these big clocks with radium were usually young women because 1800s, you could pay them less. And it wasn't until much later that it was realized, oh yeah, this crap kills you. So once again, McClure's Magazine getting out the truth. Also, another, not quite at McClure's Magazine or Collier's, but a rather dramatic thing here. This one's about the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory, a company, not factory. Woman tells a fight for life at barred doors, fire trap victim burned, draft new law to save shop workers. So as you can see there, just right away, they're pushing for laws. Where's the thing? Who is responsible? Right here. It's like, yeah, probably the person who locked the doors. Survivor's remarkable story. So yeah, this was, and then of course the illustrations here, very dramatic and heart-wrenching. Oh, have any of you read The Jungle by Upton Sinclair? No? Don't eat while you're reading it. This tells of the situation in meatpacking plants back in the 1800s. And boy, it ain't great. The Jungle was very popular, I'll just say that much, to the point that European countries stopped just stopped buying American processed meat until we fixed our shit, because this was so bad. Besides the sanitary conditions being terrible in the meatpacking plants, like people would lose fingers and limbs and it would just get packed into the meat because we ain't stopping the conveyor belt and getting your bits off. Yeah, bad news in the meatpacking plants in this time. And there wasn't a whole lot of the second bit, but a lot of it was like the meat was going bad, but we're just cramming it into the cans and sending it off anyway. Today you're like, oh, there's an incident of salmonella in like a thing, and everything's recalled. But back then it was just like, everybody's got salmonella and like E. coli and all of this stuff, but don't worry about it. It doesn't matter. And then this guy comes along and suddenly it's a problem. Okay, we will talk about the settlement houses next time. And what else? Women's suffrage and more progressivism. Prohibition. Oh, that's going to be fun. Yeah. So I'll see you guys next time.